chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, let me start off by saying that this is an amendment that the Congressional Budget Office has said is cost neutral, so we're not talking about revenue coming in or going out. Second thing about this amendment is it's not dispositive. It doesn't ultimately make a decision. And the third thing is this is an amendment that is supported not only by the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, but by every single subcommittee chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. So what does it do? It simply states that before we turn out the lights on the men and women who without question have the most expertise and experience and who've had the legal authority to assemble the teams to fight our wars and respond to our national emergencies, we're going to know who will replace them. Anytime this nation faces a crisis, there are two observations that always emerge. First, we realize how ineffective our government agencies are in assembling cross-agency teams to respond to that crisis. And secondly, we realize how good our military is at putting those teams together. One of the reasons for our military success is that for over a decade, whether we go to war to defend our homeland, the military does it as a team. They can bring together a Coast Guard cutter, Army Special Ops units, Marine Expeditionary units, an Air Force squadron, a Navy carrier group, reserve units, and even when needed, our allied partners in a combined response that we call jointness. It is a competitive advantage for which no nation in the world can rival us, yet as hard as it is to believe, an advantage we did not have just 20 years ago. And one of the reasons we have had that advantage is that for over a decade, a single group has had the legal authority to bring those teams together, and that was the Joint Forces Command. They've assembled the majority of our forces in Iraq, a majority in Afghanistan. They've had control of over 80% of our continental U.S.-based combat-ready conventional forces, and they've assembled our military teams for our national disasters. On August 9th of 2010, the Secretary of Defense announced he was closing that command, allegedly to save money. But the next day when the Pentagon briefers came, they were asked by the House Armed Services staff one question: how much money will you save? And their answer was, not a clue. We don't have a clue. For days, weeks, months, members have been asking how much this is going to save and who's going to be able to put teams together when this command is gone. The Pentagon's response has been deafeningly silent. It's not because they're bad people, it's just because they don't know the answer. This amendment, Mr. Chairman, simply says the answers to those questions are too important for us not to wait until September 30th, which is all this amendment does, to give our committees and this body the chance to get the answers and to make sure we do not go back 20 years. If there's any member in this room who can answer even the most basic core question presented by this closure, which is who will ultimately have the legal authority to put together the teams we need to fight our wars and respond to our crisis, then they can vote with good conscience against this amendment. But you can't, because nobody at the Pentagon can answer that question either. Mr. Chairman, this nation deserves a better answer than we don't have a clue, and this amendment gives them a chance to find that answer, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves the balance of his time. Does the gentleman from Washington take the time in opposition?
Yes, I request the time in opposition and
gentleman's recognized.
Ask unanimous consent to revise and extend
Without
my
objection.
remarks. The amendment would prohibit the use of funds to take any action to disestablish the Joint Forces Command. In FY 2010, Secretary of Defense Gates recommended disestablishing the Joint Forces Command and included this as part of his efficiencies initiatives in the fiscal year 2012 budget request. On January 6, 2011, President Obama issued an official memorandum accepting the recommendations of Secretary Gates and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mike Mullen and approved disestablishment of Joint Forces Command. The Department of Defense expects to save at least $240 million annually by disestablishing the command. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff retains responsibility for promoting joint operations. Essential functions and the resources needed to perform these functions will be assigned to other organizations in Hampton Roads and the Navy Support Activity in Norfolk, Virginia. All told, DoD estimates that about 50% of the current level of effort will remain in Norfolk, Virginia area. And, you know, we've been through so many rounds of BRAC, and I can sympathize with the gentleman from Virginia, and I understand his concerns about this. But, your side is taking the position that we have to reduce spending on some of the most sensitive programs that we have in our government. I happen to have chaired the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee just for a brief time, but was a member of the committee for 32 years, and am now the ranking Democratic member. And we went through this budget very carefully this year. Mr. Young and I did, and we came up with $15 billion of cuts. We have to give some respect to the Secretary of Defense, who in fact was a Republican and serving in this administration, on his recommendations. And some of these things I know are painful when it affects your local community. I've had that problem over the years myself. But just like the alternate engine, sometimes we have to make these hard decisions. And the Secretary of Defense, I think in this case, deserves the benefit of the doubt. I think the Virginia delegation is totally correct in asking for some substantiation for what they're doing and why they're doing it. But, Joint Forces Command, I've been there and visited there. The responsibility is to assign forces to various contingencies. And, we only have so many forces. So if you look at all the plans there are, there's going to be this fleet or this division or this going here, there, and everywhere, depending on what the scenario is. So I think the Chairman Mike Mullen or whoever the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Joint Chiefs can do that just as well as having a separate command. And again, I say we have to make some hard decisions. And we are cutting the heart out of the domestic programs of this country, and defense has to give something up here. And this, I think, if you look at the various commands, this one makes as much sense. And the Secretary of Defense has made the decision. It's supported by the top members of the Joint Staff, and for that reason, I regretfully have to object to the and oppose the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, would the gentleman yield for a question?
Of course.
I would just ask the gentleman if all of this amendment does is to give us until September the 30th to answer those questions. All the leases are in effect. They can't be changed until that period of time. So we're not talking about cost, but this is the question I would ask the gentleman. You mentioned that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had the authority to be that joint provider and to allocate those troops. But I would ask the gentleman if, in fact, because Goldwater-Nichols and the Reauthorization Act expressly prohibited them from being able to do that. And so I would ask the gentleman if it doesn't make sense, at least before we cut out the lights, regardless of the ultimate decision you make, to make absolutely sure we know who's going to be able to have that authority before we make that final decision.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman's point. As I've been told, there's been an effort to try and keep 50% of the people and the activities in your area in Virginia, and that's one of the most important defense areas the country has. So I think you guys are working hard, and I think that the department is responding as best they can. But again, I think we should reject the amendment and let this thing work out as the department has recommended. And I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman, can I inquire how much time I have left, Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from Virginia has a minute and a half remaining.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to this time yield 45 seconds to Congressman Whitman from Virginia.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 45 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment offered by my colleague from Virginia. This amendment would give Congress time to conduct oversight over the decision to close Joint Forces Command, pure and simple. And specifically, it would allow us to determine how the closure could impact national security. In August, it was announced by the Pentagon that JFCOM would be disestablished, but there was no transparency in that decision. Congress was not informed, and Congress asked multiple times for the analysis that was done that led to the decision to close JFCOM without getting that information. This leads me to believe that a thorough and detailed analysis into the JFCOM decision was never conducted. It leads me also to believe that in 5 years, the Pentagon will be asking Congress to set up a mechanism to ensure jointness among our services. Capabilities exist under JFCOM that are vital to our national security and paramount to our success in the current wars the military is fighting. Without that analysis, we cannot know whether we're casting away years of joint experience that will be crucial to the future defense of this nation. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the Congressman from Virginia's 2nd District, Congressman Ridgel.
Gentleman's recognized for 45 seconds.
I thank my good friend for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of the Forbes Joint Forces Command Amendment. The establishment of a combatant command requires a literal act of Congress. It follows, then, that the closure of a combatant command should involve thoughtful analysis that is shared with this body for comment. The closure of Joint Forces Command fails on that important count. Either no such analysis has been conducted or it is being withheld. Mr. Chairman, the absence of data that supports the closure of a combatant command is simply unacceptable. Accordingly, this cost-neutral amendment delays its closure. Mr. Chairman, I ask my colleagues to join me in voting in favor of the Forbes Joint Forces Command Amendment. I thank the gentleman and yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. All time has expired. The questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia, all those in favor signify so by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to.